The requirements for this assignment are very similar to the last assignment. You'll need to know how to get into the shell of a container when you run it or after the fact, and know some basics around Linux distributions and what something like Ubuntu might be different than Alpine or CentOS. And of course, running a container. And then the basics of how DNS records might work, like what an alias record is or how to create one. That would be handy because you're going to be doing some testing around DNS. For your next assignment, we're going to do some DNS round robin testing. And if you're not familiar with DNS round robin, it's the concept that you can have two different hosts with DNS aliases that respond to the same DNS name. So when you think about something like Google.com, obviously they got more than one server. So one of the techniques that big companies use to always make sure they're up 24/7 is to employ DNS round robin as part of their strategy, so that there's actually multiple IP addresses and DNS records behind the name you're using on the internet. Now in containers, it actually gets a lot simpler. So here, we've actually got this feature in Docker Engine 1.11 and newer. We've had a feature where if we create a custom network, we can actually assign an alias so that multiple containers can respond to the same DNS name. So for this one, you're going to first create a new virtual network, call it whatever you want. And you're going to set up two containers using a new image called Elasticsearch, and specifically the version 2 of Elasticsearch. So Elasticsearch isn't really a part of this course, but it's becoming a popular data store for, well, really just for search, hence the name, right? So it's actually in a JSON format when you hit it from curl. So what we're going to do is we're going to actually use it as a quick test because it's really easy to use in this scenario. So you want to research and check out the --net-alias command. That's actually an option for Docker run. And so when you start a container, you're going to tell it, I want another DNS alias to call this container by, not just its container name. And this gets around a little problem that if you've ever used Docker in production and you've started to add a lot of containers, you realize you can't add multiple containers with the same name, but how can I resolve DNS on my networks and maybe have the same app installed twice? Maybe I've got a dev and a test environment on the same Docker server, and I need to, in both of those, call something search in the DNS. Well, this is how you get around that limitation. You can just keep adding net aliases to your containers when creating them, and you'll find out that they can actually respond just like a DNS round robin does. So once you've started those up, you can use the Alpine image to do an NS lookup, and that'll simply return to you a list of the DNS addresses for the name search. And remember, on that one, you're going to have to make sure that it's signed with the --net to the same network that you assigned the first two containers. And then after you've got both of those containers resolving to the same search name, you can actually use the curl command to get a quick output of the Elasticsearch server. And this is a little trick with Elasticsearch and why it's good to use in this demo. The curl command actually comes with the CentOS image, so it's easy to just use CentOS in this case instead of Alpine or Ubuntu. And also, Elasticsearch runs on port 9200, and since it returns an easy, short JSON result, it's quick and easy for this test. And lastly, Elasticsearch actually gives random names to itself inside its configuration when it first starts up. It's kind of similar to how containers give themselves random names if you don't specify. So what we can do here is if you keep running that curl command over and over, you'll actually notice that the output, even though you're using the same search DNS name to do a curl on, you'll actually flip back and forth between the two different Elasticsearch containers. And it might not be even. It's not going to exactly be one, then the other, then the first one, then the second one. It's going to be a little off because that's kind of one of the downsides of DNS round robin is it's not a true load balancer. I like to kind of call it the poor man's load balancer. But in this case, it'll give you a sense of how to use a virtual network with DNS built in to make it easy to use multiple containers that have the same name. And as always, you can skip to the next lecture to watch me walk through it as I would do it. But you might get to the same end result with typing slightly different commands or launching your containers slightly different way.